Well, hello everybody. Welcome again to a very special edition of the Erasmus Forum podcast. Today we're discussing this book. It's a book by Alexander Larman, my special guest here. Welcome along, Alexander. It's a book called Lazarus, the Second Coming of David Bowie. A brilliant biography, if I may say, chronicling the rebirth of David Bowie from the late 90s to the, shall we say, graceful and moving death that coincided with the releases of his final album, Black Star, 10 years ago this month. So how is the book going so far?
Well, so far so good, which is not a guaranteed thing anymore, because the nature of music biography is what I didn't realise is that my publisher, who are an excellent independent publisher called New Modern, they informed me after a couple of weeks of a book being out, well, we don't necessarily expect music biography is going to sell very well. And as soon as you hear that, you think, oh. But the reality is that writing about music is, in a sense, dancing about architecture, because you have to think to yourself, you have on Spotify or any other good streaming service every single Bowie album you could ever want to hear. So why on earth would you want to go and spend £25 on a book about him? And so I was very much aware, while I was writing the book, what is the added value? What are you going to say that's going to persuade somebody who might have, as one critic said of me, measured out my life in Bowie spoons? What's actually going to make you go to your local Waterstones and pay this money for the book? And what I was very much aware with Bowie, who I've been a fan of for not all my life, but certainly more than half my life, I was aware that there was a story that hadn't been told, because we all know and love 70s Bowie and early 80s Bowie. We had this idea of the imperial phase of Bowie, from, shall we say, Space Oddity up till Let's Dance, which is 14 years, which I think is essentially unmatched by anybody in terms of the achievements, in terms of the astonishing albums, the astonishing songs. But to me, biography has to be about a life and a situation as much as it is about achievement. And what I was always interested in, even when I was getting into Bowie in the 90s and early 2000s, is but there's another side, isn't there? There's this other side of Bowie where he isn't achieving everything. He is not this all-conquering figure. He's actually almost like Hamlet. He's racked by self-doubt. He is making these albums which are not connecting with the public anymore. They're not connecting with critics. They're not connecting with Bowie. And then I heard this story about how when he released his second album with Tin Machine, this unloved early 90s hard rock band he was part of, he performed at the Brixton Academy in the autumn of 1991, and he obviously was born in Brixton. He spent his first formative years there, and he asked for his tour bus should divert past his old house in Brixton. He got out of the bus, and one of his bandmates observed him standing there, weeping in the street. And then Bowie came back into the bus and said, "It's a miracle, I should have been an accountant." And that's how I always wanted to start the book, because I always liked the idea that Bowie saw how things had gone. He'd gone from having this extraordinary period. He could do no wrong. He was this figure of absolute renown, absolute love, to all of a sudden he isn't that anymore. And yet, it's a miracle. And to me, the concept of the miraculous and the concept of the sacred and the profane was what I always wanted to deal with in Lazarus, and the reason why it's got the title, which is obviously quasi-religious in nature. Partly because, structurally, there is not just a second coming, but a third coming as well. But also the sense that with anyone who, like Bowie, was touched by genius, it's almost hard to explain it in any other way apart from the quasi-divine. And so that's what I really wanted to get into in the concept of Lazarus and the concept of rebirth. And if that makes it sound pretentious, I apologise. But ultimately, with somebody like Bowie, there is a love that people feel for Bowie, which I think transcends what you would usually feel for a musician. I mean, I speak for myself here, but my daughter has Bowie as her middle name. She was born 5 days after he died, so her initials are EBL, Rose Evelyn Bowie Larman. So she really is Rebel. And I can't imagine her being Rose Evelyn McCartney Larman or Rose Evelyn Dylan Larman. I think there is a sense that, because it's interesting with Bowie, he was this otherworldly, quite removed, quite remote figure. And yet we feel ownership of him. We feel that he's somebody who belongs to us. We feel that, like Alden's Yates, he became his admirers. And it's really difficult because I think in the book, I try and deal with the idea of why this happened and how we get into the concept of Bowie becoming this figure who was universally beloved, because he wasn't a sort of cozy McCartney-ish figure. He wasn't having big sing-alongs to Hey Jude. I mean, of course, I went to his concerts, as did you, and we would see him do Heroes, and Heroes would get a big sing-along, but it's a weird song. I mean, it's a weird song musically. The time signature is odd. How the chorus doesn't come till 3 minutes into it is odd. There's a lot of strange stuff musically. Then lyrically, it's the fact that it's a song about two lovers standing by the Berlin Wall about to be executed.
There was a very good documentary on Radio 4 about that a few years ago, I think, about the relationship that Bowie had with a particular girlfriend in Berlin at the time in that period. And she talked very vividly about that relationship when they were standing by the wall. So,
But she wasn't shot. So that's
no, but with the going back to his death 10 years ago this month, and I remember listening to the radio to Today and Nick Robinson announcing his death, and I was quite sad and slightly shocked.
Yeah.
Even though I knew he'd been ill for a while and his health was quite brittle. Is it because he's the first of the icons who's left the building, as it were? We've still got Jagger, we've still got McCartney, we've still got Dylan. But he was the first to die.
First of a gang to die,
Yeah.
words of his Noir Morrissey. Yes, certainly. I mean, if you look at these people who have died, obviously we lost John Lennon many decades ago. We lost Freddie Mercury 3.5 decades.
But they're not in that. Would you agree they're not in the same category
Not as songwriters, no. I mean, as performers, as icons, yes, but in terms of the quality of the songs, nowhere near. And it's interesting because if you look at people who can be compared to Bowie, 2016, of course, you have 4 major figures who died. You had Bowie, you had Prince, you had Leonard Cohen, you had George Michael. 10 years on, we're not talking about Prince, Leonard Cohen, or George Michael in the same way. It was always a bit of a punt on my part to release this book now in January, literally 10 years after he died, because I started writing it in 2023 and I did not know if Bowie's anniversary of the death was going to be a big deal or not, because 10 years, I mean, is that big a deal 10 years on? And so you feel that if it is a big deal and people come behind it, the book will do well. And if they don't, it's going to be quite embarrassing, because another major writer who shall remain nameless released a book about Bowie in November last year that didn't sell at all, partly because he'd released another book about 10 years ago, but also because I think that there was not a sense last November of there being any particular appetite for discussing Bowie. And on the one hand, I was quite relieved because I thought, well, that's not going to be queering the pitch for my book. But on the other hand, I thought to myself, have I got this horribly wrong? Because whenever you write a book about anyone, I mean, I've written books about Lord Rochester, Lord Byron, the Duke of Windsor, and now Bowie, and they're all figures who, Rochester perhaps less so, but the others, they are major figures who are discussed on a daily basis somewhere in the world. And you think to yourself, what do I have to say that's new and original and hopefully interesting? And in the case of Bowie, I think it was a harder task than the others, because it's only been 10 years since he's been gone. I mean, if I was writing this book in 100 years, it would be a very different book, because one thing that one reviewer took me to task for was not writing about Bowie's private life. And I made a decision quite early on not to attempt to write a kind of gossipy book, because as far as I'm concerned, he met and married Iman and his private life was happy. Maybe we'll find out one day it wasn't. Maybe we'll find out it was wrapped with all kinds of awfulness. But for purposes of the book I was writing, it doesn't matter. Now, you see, yes, you can say that in many cases, historical biographies are about a private life.
But people get very obsessive because Bowie was unique. He was very private. He controlled his life, and he controlled the amount of stuff that came out in terms of the release and what he was doing artistically and so forth. So he was very clever in that way.
But of course, what's so interesting is that now at the V&A East, we have this entire museum of Bowie. We have an entire collection of 80,000 artifacts. And I was aware while writing the book, it was a shame I didn't have another year. Because if I'd had another year, I could have gone to the V&A East, there would have been much more detail in the book. But on the other hand, the book is 125,000 words long now. If it was another 75,000 words longer, it would still be the same book, book, just with a lot more detail.
Wait till the paperwork version.
Well, it's interesting actually, because there was a part of me that wanted to go to Vienna East, and because there is a last chapter in the book called the bonus track, where I went to Vienna East and I saw some of the stuff there, and you fold it in. But I mean, I didn't have time to rewrite the book, because there will be more books about Bowie, and there'll be some excellent books about Bowie, and there'll be some rubbish books about Bowie, because apparently there have been 100 books written about him since the
I didn't know that.
No, but I can well believe that. There's a man, Simon Goddard, who was writing a book about every single year of his life in the 70s. And I've been at events with other Bowie biographers, and of course what's so wonderful is that, I say biographers, but very few people are doing a cradle-to-grave biography of Bowie, because ultimately he doesn't lend himself to that. I think also with music biography generally, people aren't that interested. I mean, it's not like biographies of kings and queens, although Bowie was both in his time. It's much more about the fact that people want to read a story about something that they haven't heard before. And what I always knew was the concept of the second half of Bowie's life and career. That's what really interested me.
But that period when he had that drought in early 80s till late 90s, would you say? Yeah.
Yes, with the exception of Outside and Murder of Suburbia, I think you really struggle to find between Let's Dance and probably He-Man. Although Outside is a terrific album, and obviously it showed that he was still firing on all cylinders. But yes, you have essentially best part of 20 years. You would not find, apart from those two albums, something really distinctive. And that, to me, is that because he was working with the wrong people? Is that because he was chasing for wrong things? Perhaps. But it's also because if you say to a genius, write work of genius, they can't do it. I mean, I've often done my worst stuff when I've been, the figurative colours pointed to my head, because I feel under pressure. Whereas if you write what you want, and if you write what you're interested in, you do better.
I'm talking about the pressure, of course. He did a great version of that, of course. He owns it now. He did own it eventually, with Annie Lennox in 1992 at the Freddie Mercury tribute concert. There was a little incident there at the end of the set where he did the Lord's Prayer, which didn't go down too well with the rest of the remaining members of Queen, I think, yes?
No, I think the Prime May especially, who by that point so much the de facto leader in the arena, was rather put out, because what I think it's fair to say is that the Freddie Mercury tribute concert was the highest profile event of its kind since Live Aid. And Live Aid has changed the formula of what people expected from that kind of concert, because anyone who'd been involved in Live Aid, who'd done it successfully, Queen may be an obvious example, raised to another level, not just of sales, but also in terms of awareness. Because lest we forget about Queen, pre-Live Aid, they were tarred by having played Sun City. There was a sense they were yesterday's band. Freddie Mercury comes on, 20 minutes, steals the show, boom, until his death. They were a massive, massive band again. Bowie, by then, he is struggling. He's been a tin machine. Tin Machine have not done what we wanted them to do commercially. I mean, artistically, they might have done, but we'll leave that aside. He knows he has to make it splash. He knows he has to be noticed again. And he's doing his songs very well, but at the end of the day, it's David Bowie coming on, and he's in that slight area of becoming a heritage act, becoming somebody whose best days are behind him. And you think, right, I'm going to do something outrageous now. It's like that indecent exposure. But in a sense, it is indecent exposure, because the question that I ask, and I really asked myself while I was writing the book and writing about a chapter of the book, is why did he do it and what were his motives? And I think it was shown.
So I was going to ask you that question, because spirituality is quite important in the book about Bowie. But so you believe that was just a performative thing?
And if that sounds damning and dismissive, it's not meant to. But I think he realised, because, for instance, he said it was a friend of his called Craig. I spent a very long time trying to find who this man Craig was. There's no record whatsoever. Because one thing you have to remember with somebody like Bowie is, after all, he didn't make friends. He made celebrity friends. He would take up younger artists and younger bands. But he wasn't making friends in the way that you and I might, because it wasn't possible. That's the nature of celebrity. But he was such a high-profile figure. When do you meet people? You can't go about in normal life. You can't make friends the way that anybody else does. You are somebody at this rarefied echelon.
That's the great thing about the, quite touching really, but the V&A exhibition. He visits with his daughter and his wife, and they managed to go.
Yeah.
And they managed to go there before the place opens up to the public. And apparently he was quite touched by the whole exhibition. Yeah.
It's a lovely story because I've often thought about the Bowie story in visual terms. I mean, the idea of Bowie getting there at 8 in the morning and just wandering around, seeing his life beforehand.
Yeah.
Because he didn't cooperate directly with that exhibition. He said to his archivist, off you go, give them what they want, but we will correct anything that's factually inaccurate, but we will not have any kind of say. And it's fascinating because he knew what he was doing as usual, because that came out at almost the same time as the last one of the penultimate album the next day. And that obviously created interest in Bowie again, because there's the Reality album in 2003. And if that had been his last album and he died of his heart attack on stage in Germany in 2004, I wouldn't have written the book. Because I wouldn't have thought it was a story, or I wouldn't have written this book. I might have thought there was a Bowie book to be written. But it would have been rather a sad ending. It would have been rather an anticlimactic ending as well. That you would have felt a sense of, this is not the end he deserved to have.
I mean, he did that critically acclaimed appearance at Glastonbury, didn't he, in 2000? That gave him a lot of confidence again, I suppose.
Well, that was the comeback. That's the moment at which, I mean, I remember this first time round. There was very much a sense that Bowie had returned. And after a shaky 90s, once again, he was this figure who he was all conquering. And Kayla Moran, over times, who a few years before had written very negatively about Bowie, she was at the concert and she said how we'll miss him when he's gone. And I think that was a wonderful way of putting it, because it was really encapsulating a sense both of glory but also of fragility, that Bowie, he wasn't back then somebody that you look at and think he'll be dead soon. He wasn't a kind of a Pete Doherty-esque figure, but there was also a sense that people felt protective of him in a way that you probably never felt protective of, say, a Brian May character.
No, but he looked physically remarkably well when you considered the first period, when he looked so awful, back in the day with the Alan Yantop documentary and so forth. And his latter period looked really healthy and well, and I guess the damage he'd done was quite extensive.
Popularised, yeah, that's the problem, isn't it? But what he'd done to his body was so awful that despite the fact that he was fit and he was quite well, he died of liver.
But there's something really enjoyable about his performances post 2000.
He was a different figure back then. I mean, I saw him three and a half times, in 2002, 2003, 2004. You were not seeing Bowie as he would have been in the 70s. No. You were not seeing something where there was any danger, any sense of what's going to happen now. You were seeing a very polished, I'd say pop act, but that's too demeaning. You were saying a very polished popular music act, and he was very good. He had a great band. It was very tight.
He was comfortable in his skin playing the hits, I guess, again. Yeah.
But actually, it's funny because the last performance of his I saw at the Isle of Wight in 2004, he didn't play that many hits. I mean, he played title of Song Station to Station, he played Quicksand, he didn't do Life on Mars, didn't do Starman, didn't do Changes, didn't do a lot of the songs you'd have expected. And it's a festival audience. I mean, I think the rule of the festival is you play the hits, but he wasn't interested. And I suppose that's the thing up to the end of Bowie's life. He was never interested in doing what people expected him to do.
Now, artistically, he's had such an effect on so many people. What about Bowie's influences himself? I'd like to talk a little bit about Scott Walker and his influence on Bowie. Very similar in styles, yes?
Well, it's really funny for me because I've always felt the similarities between Scott Walker and Bowie have not been talked about enough. So I go quite heavy on it in the book because, first of all, I think Scott Walker is an astonishing talent who has not quite received his due. But Bowie was always his biggest fan. And certainly, I mean, if you listen to a song like Life on Mars and the swooping and the soaring, it's obviously influenced by Bowie. And actually, one of my other great musical idols, Neil Hannon of the Divine Comedy, another great Scott Walker fan. The similarities between Hannon, Walker and Bowie, I think, are very strong and very interesting. As far as I know, Bowie and Walker only ever met once in the mid-90s when Walker came to one of the outside gigs and then came backstage at Wembley. There's a story about how they met in the book. But one of the things that makes me tear up, actually, in the book is the description of how when it was Bowie's 50th, he was being interviewed on Radio 1 by Marianne Hobbs. And it was a very laddie interview, and it's a classic thing. All his peers were asking him questions. And of course, because it's the 90s, it was all men, not a single woman allowed to ask him anything. And then she said, and I've got a special treat for you now. Oh no, what is it? And she plays this tape recording of Scott Walker. He's not asking a question. He's just saying, here I am on this crappy tape recording, just wishing you well and saying how much you've inspired me. And then it's fascinating because there was this 30-second pause, which they cut down to about 8 seconds on air. And Bowie's crying. And it's really, really interesting because it's the only time that you actually see Bowie genuinely affected. And he doesn't know what to say. He says, "Oh, I see God in the window." And it's fascinating because it's this insight into the real Bowie, or indeed David Jones. And actually, everything that I saw and heard and read, that's the only time, apart from, he's dying on stage, that's a bit different, when you actually see the real person underneath the facade. Because David Jones, we don't know who David Jones was. Bowie would often say, this is the persona. You are seeing the cracked actor, you're seeing Ziggy Stardust, you're seeing an actor. David Jones is somewhere far away from this.
So that tribute from Scott Walker caught him off guard. So that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah.
Is the real person comes out.
And I've listened to it a lot of times because I've had to be absolutely sure it isn't him acting. And it really isn't, because all the other performances, all the other moments where, it's like whenever Bono does one on stage, there's always a bit just before he sings, I can't keep holding on, all got his hurts.
He's become a much relieved.
But there's a crack in the voice, as if he's got that one time. But it's a stage trick, and Bowie had so many stage tricks. But no, it's the way.
It's a protective barrier, of course, isn't it?
Of course. But it's the way with Scott Walker, but genuinely, that Walker got to him, and that outside, at 1.4, he might not release it, because Walker was releasing it out in Tilt and more or less the same time. And I think Bowie Force and Brian Eno, who co-wrote and co-produced Outside, I think they both were thinking, well, if Scott Walker's done the same thing we're going to do, we won't bother releasing it. But of course, Scott Walker wasn't a commercial force. And actually, the funny thing is, these days, I do not know who rates Scott Walker. I mean, I think he's an absolute god. But
if you listen to lots of Six music, he's become quite a figure there. And back in the day, of course, he was that sort of crooner thing, in the 60s, early 70s. The other important influencer with Bowie, of course, is his producer, Tony Visconti.
Yes.
Can we talk a little bit about their relationship?
It was very interesting because I've never met Tony Visconti. I wrote a piece for Telegraph about Baal, which is an obscure Brecht film that Bowie made in the early 80s. And it's shown again on television a few years ago. And I did this piece and I interviewed Tony Visconti over email. Visconti was very forthcoming, he's very generous with his time, he would give me these very lucid, very interesting answers. So when I was commissioned to write the book, he was literally the first person who I wrote to, and I sent him an email along the lines of, Tony, let's chat. And I didn't get an email back from him. I got an email from his manager saying Tony would not be able to participate because he was writing his own memoir. And so for a couple of days, I actually thought to myself, is this going to founder? Because without people who had worked with Bowie, who played with Bowie, there wouldn't have been a book. But thankfully, it worked out exceptionally well. And I mean, Visconti he is in the book, both in terms of the interview I did with him and in terms of his other interviews. But yes, I would have liked to have interviewed him. I think the difficulty is that he was and is such a good PR man for Bowie and for himself that we can almost over-exaggerate his influence. But certainly Reeves Cabrels, who played Bowie throughout the 90s and co-wrote more songs with him than anyone else, one of the things I was trying to do in the book was to rehabilitate Reeves, because I feel that because the 90s Bowie is the unfashionable Bowie, Reeves has not been given the attention and interest that he should have had. But certainly you've got several albums, when you've got the two Tin Machine albums, you've got Outside, Earthling and Hours, on which Reeves is very, very prominent. And I think it's really important, looking at that, to take this person. I mean, that's 5 albums. I mean, okay, Visconti produced more albums, but he doesn't have the songwriting credits. And I feel that there are so many people in the Bowie story. And of course, one thing I'd like to clear up is that there's this idea of Bowie as being ruthless and ditching collaborators and moving on, being like a vampire. And I think it's not that, is it? It's that, I mean, for me, for instance, this is the third publisher I've put a book out with. And obviously it cuts both ways, but you publish books with a publisher who you feel most comfortable with, and they obviously publish books with the authors that I feel comfortable with. And this book would not have worked with my last publisher, Fine Nicholson, because I'm not a music publisher. So I feel that, in a sense, all Bowie was doing was finding the best people around him. And if that's why this band he used between the Heathen album and the next day, he didn't use for his last album, Black Star, it is a rock album played by jazz musicians.
That's the interesting thing that Visconti says, that jazz people are better than rock artists at doing that sort of stuff.
But Black Star isn't a jazz album.
No.
That's the crucial thing. It isn't remotely a jazz album, because on that Sue single that he put out with Maria Schneider in 2014, that is a jazz single. It's very interesting, but when he reinterprets it for the album, it's a completely different feel, because I wouldn't say it's necessarily more accessible, but it feels much more like a David Bowie song as opposed to this experimental, quite abstract song.
I love reading that section in the book about the secrecy around the release of that final album because of the poignancy of the situation and everybody having to just be very aware of the situation and the secretive nature of it. That must have been quite a tense period in the recording session.
Well, I suppose it's always one of those things where, my great theory about Bowie is that Black Star was always the final statement. But if he'd released another 10 albums, there would have been a Black Star waiting at the end. Because people have asked me already, would he have done another couple of albums after Black Star? No. How can you? Because that is his final statement. Because one of the things I was always very conscious of while writing a book is not just degenerate into empty pseudery. But I talk about Donne, I talk about Death's Duel, the idea that Donne dragged himself into the pulpit for the last time in St. Paul's, where he was dean, to preach essentially his own funeral sermon. That's what Black Star is. It's Bowie's funeral sermon. And on that last song, I can't give everything away. Bowie is essentially saying, I will never be the person you want me to be. You will never understand me. Whether I understand myself or not, I don't know. But I've always felt that what Bowie was doing was, if you like, leaving breadcrumbs for us all. And that's why 10 years on, we're having these conversations about him. Because we're not having these conversations about Prince, because for the best one of the world, Prince was enigmatic and he was a strange man. But I don't think that we're as interested in the enigma now, because he was somebody so much of his time and so much of his...
Yes, he died relatively young, I suppose, didn't he?
Well, he died very young, and I don't know if it was a drug overdose or some sort of barbiturate thing, but I saw Prince at the O2.
Brilliant performer.
Fantastic.
Amazing.
But in a sense, he was live. He was a live act. I remember that that album that was given out free with the Mail on Sunday or whatever, it's a nothing album, but live, it came to life, whereas Bowie's almost the opposite. That he was a great live performer, but he wasn't the best live performer there's ever been. But what he was an astonishingly varied and rounded figure. And of course, one of the things I wanted to do in the book was to talk about him as a musician, but also as an actor, as an artist, as an internet pioneer. And all these things are things that I think are important to discuss in the round. Because if you're talking about Bowie, you're talking about somebody who was this Renaissance man. He was somebody who had real interests and real enthusiasm.
Well, he could write a book about his acting abilities, couldn't he, really?
Cracked acting.
Yeah, he did some good stuff.
He did some great stuff. And it's funny because will there be another 100 books about Bowie? Yes, I think there will. And I think people will always find angles and always find points of interest, because ultimately he was a fascinating man. And that can't be said of a lot of his peers, because when Rod Stewart goes off to the Great Gig in the Sky, he will be regarded as a very talented performer.
Again, if you look back at Rod Stewart back in the day, what a brilliant performer. Yeah. The Faces, today.
A great performer, yeah. But the thing is, when performers die, what are they leaving behind? They're leaving behind memories, of course, but they're not leaving behind a legacy.
Now, 10 years ago, David Bowie died. The landscape has changed completely in terms of social media, Instagram. He was very, very careful about how he portrayed his image publicly and privately. So maybe he would have been very aware of that situation today. Do you think?
I think that if this was in the late 90s and Bowie was still around, he would have been an absolute adopter of things like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and everything, because BowieNet was the first time that anyone really came forward and, if you will, owned the internet. Long before Kim Kardashian broke it, David Bowie fixed it, because ultimately he understood what the internet could do in terms of connectivity, but also how it could bring together artists and fans.
He did this interview with Jeremy Paxman, who was back in 1999, as regards to the internet and what he foresaw the powers of the internet.
Yeah. And obviously what it was with Bowie back then was that Bowie was ahead of the curve about everything. But Paxman was somebody who was skeptical about the internet. He was skeptical about the power of the internet. And so he was quizzing Bowie rather like you would quiz a politician. He was somebody who was, the tenor of the interview was skeptical. And at one point Paxman says, but it's just a tool, isn't it? And Bowie says, no, it's not. It's an alien life form. It's life on Mars. And it's come to Earth. And it's so fascinating because Bowie was absolutely fixated on millennial issues. He was somebody who, all through the 90s, the coming of the year 2000 preoccupied him a lot more than it preoccupied most people. I think for him, the internet was the first thing that occupied him for 9/11, because 9/11 affected Bowie very deeply. I mean, there's 2 albums, Heath and Reality, which deal with the repercussions of 9/11, because Bowie lived in New York. He saw there's a story that's in the book about how fires were burning in New York for months after 9/11. And that's just the most, that's Boschian, isn't it?
It is.
The idea of these fires on the street burning. And so you think to yourself, you have feared the coming of the new millennium, and then it's fire and blood. And I think that talking about the internet and missing what's going to bring us all together, I often think to myself, imagine if we'd had Twitter on 9/11. Imagine what that would have been like. Imagine what Bowie was going on.
Do you have a favorite Bowie album? Difficult question.
It's very interesting because Bowie recorded 27 studio albums, and I think it's fair to say that, there's probably 9 exceptional albums, 9 good albums, and probably 9 less good albums. But if we look at the top 9, the ones I come back to over and over again are some of the great 70s and early 80s albums. I come back to no particular order. Ziggy, Hunky Dory, Low, Scary Monsters, Heroes. For all brilliant albums. The 2 I think that I constantly think about are Station to Station, which is probably my favorite Bowie album, and Black Star, because they are very similar albums. They're both quite short. Station to Station is 6 songs. Black Star is 7 songs. They've both got these 10-minute title tracks. It's very obvious to me that Black Star was a response to Station, and the song Dollar Days is clearly a response to Word on a Wing. They're both songs in a sense. Word on a Wing is a song about faith, Dollar Days is a song about dying. And it's the way in which he reached back. There's 40 years between the albums, but he was conscious at that point about revisiting his past. For instance, on the next day, on the song You Feel So Lonely You Can Die, it ends with the drum beat from 5 years. And then imagine that you take an entire album which is a response to another album. And again, it's funny because if you read the reviews of Black Star when it came out, they're not talking about Station to Station, whereas now the kinship between those 2 albums, those 2 extraordinary albums, is stronger than you can ever imagine.
We should have time to talk about the videos and so forth and his artwork, but we don't have any time, unfortunately. We've run out of time. Alexander, it's been absolute delight. Thank you so much for talking about your new book about David Bowie, Lazarus, The Second Coming, which is in all good bookshops now. If you're a Bowie fan, a rock fan, go out and buy a copy now. And Alexander, thank you very much indeed. And I wish you all the best with the publication of the book. Thank you.